All right, so sorry for being a little bit late. I guess the internet was down all over the state of Montana, and so nobody could broadcast. And let me get my channel up here just so I can see what I'm doing. So it appeared like no one could broadcast anywhere in the country, and it's working. And so a little behind, still going to broadcast, and we'll go from there. We'll pick up with the Articles of Confederation, which I started on Monday. And a couple things with the test really quick. First off, for some reason on Teams, it was erasing a score I would put in on the short IDs, and I have no idea why. And I thought maybe I just forgot or didn't type it in, but I know for a fact there were ones that it just removed it and gave you a 0. And so I tried to go through and change that and try to give you a few more points. And so hopefully, if you saw a grade that didn't seem right and you might have got a few more points, I have no idea what happened. I had to make a bunch of changes. It was it was annoying, to say the least. I have no idea what happened. So there are people I know I gave a score, just disappeared. And hopefully that'll work. And if there is an issue, please let me know. But I am going to give some of you a chance, especially if you got below an 80. But most of you didn't. Most of you did quite well. 80s and 90s are good, especially on the first test. I was impressed. Some very good short IDs. But if you got below an 80, I'll give you a chance to do a couple of the short IDs again. I want people to feel good about those. I want you to... I got a bunch of emojis now, thank you. But I want people to kind of get an idea how to do those short IDs. If you get that process, you will do... this is weird. Okay. So I just want you to feel confident about writing, confident about doing that. Multiple choice, those just take practice. And you have the multiple choice in front of you. Go back and look at the ones you have for the test, at least as far as I know. You can do that. And so please go back and look at those multiple choice, look at the ones you missed. Hopefully you can go like, I should have known. And I know there's a few of you who made changes and... Okay, enough emojis. I know there's a few of you who made changes and turned out to have changed to the wrong answer. Boy, I hate that too. And so I will get back to you since I couldn't get online. I'll tell you which ones you can do. If you got over an 80, but there's one short ID you're really blue, I'll give you a chance to get a couple more points. I just want people to get feel good about this first one. And this is all messed up. It's really hard to do this in these circumstances, so I sympathize immensely. Don't forget I did assign the first 20 pages of chapter, I think it's 6. And this is another one of those huge chapters that goes through the Confederation, Congress, through the Federalists. And so we'll get through that. I'm going to go fairly fast and through these Articles of Confederation, we'll get to the Constitution and go from there. So if there's any questions, please post it. And okay, so we got through the Articles of Confederation. And if you remember from, get my days right, Monday, talked about how they required 13 votes to amend it, 9 votes to pass a law. It had no executive, so there's nobody to carry out the laws. It just expected the states to do it. And this is approximately where I quit yesterday. Most of the classes had no power to tax. And if you can't tax, you can't borrow money. And if you can't borrow money, if you can't tax, you have no power to control the money supply, meaning you can't control the currency. There's inflation. You can't control inflation or deflation. This is a huge problem. Now, let's be clear about it. Everybody was on something close to what we call a gold standard, and that gives you a lot of difficulty controlling your own money supply. It's a little like what happened in your lifetime in places like Greece, where they can't control the money supply. But still, if you can't print your own currency, nobody knows about the future. They can't predict what their money will be worth, what their wealth will be. And therefore, it will be very difficult to make future decisions. For example, if you were somebody who was an entrepreneur and wanted to start a business, you would be very reluctant to take a risk if you don't know what your dollar is worth, let alone if there'll be any dollars, let alone there'll be a country. And so a bad economic time. No single voice for foreign policy. They could not enforce treaties. When I mean they could not enforce treaties, the big one is the Treaty of Paris. Spain blocked off the Mississippi. Loyalists did not get their land. There were fishing issues. The British never left the Great Lakes. The United States independence was very shaky. And there was no single voice for trade. Trade, countries have to establish rules about taxes, about what products will be allowed, safety standards, a whole number of things. Here, every state would set up their own system. No military. The states were supposed to provide their militia. Well, how can they provide their militia if there's no one to enforce them to? And militias, as we talked about before, are pretty shaky in a fight against a regular force. They were basically designed by this time to put down slave rebellions. So, lastly, there's no federal court system. If there's no federal court system, that means, for example, people in one state can't sue another state, or people in one state cannot sue a state because they're infringed to, for example, trade over state lines. There's no way for them to communicate with each other. So state conflicts aren't going to be resolved. And this is an issue to this day about the power of courts, but there is a federal court system now. And let alone if a state does something that is deemed to be, let's say, against the Confederation Congress. So the states are like, what are you going to do about it? And so this government is incredibly weak. The first big issue that came up were those western lands. If you look at this map I put up here, hopefully you can see it. It shows the old Northwest and all these areas that were claimed by Virginia, Connecticut, Massachusetts. In fact, let me get my pointer. So Virginia, Massachusetts, and Connecticut claimed all this land. See, in the South, it's a hodgepodge of claims. New York claimed all this area. So I think you might get this, or might see the point. Everybody's claiming different areas. Don't forget, what's going to be Vermont is claimed by 2 different states. They all want it. They want the size of the population, the land, all sorts of reasons. So one of the big things they have to do is come up with a solution for this. So these competing land claims, a lot of states were thinking, okay, we have debt, we get this land, we sell it, we pay back our bonds. Remember, bonds are how governments borrow money. And speculators, remember the Ohio River Valley? They want to come and get this land cheap. If they could buy from the states cheap, especially desperate states with a lot of debt like Pennsylvania, they could, boom, scoop it up and get rich. Or New York, huge amount of debt. They could buy it cheap, sell for a lot of money. And look at this land claim in New York, some of the best agricultural land in the United States. And there were squatters coming in. Remember Daniel Boone crossing the Cumberland Gap, going into Kentucky? They wanted this land. And since the legal claim was up in the air, the squatters are basically saying, hey, if you guys can't figure it out, we're just going to take it. And I'm not even mentioning here the various tribes here that this is their land. And this goes back to the Proclamation of 1763, which the British said is their land. And you have all these competing claims. And you might say, wait a second, the British are gone. They don't care. That's their land. And so with that, also sticking there was the fact that the West, all that area in green on this map right here, might break away. That's why the Mississippi River and New Orleans was such an important facet of the Treaty of Paris, which the Articles could not enforce. This would be a fear all the way up until arguably the 1830s with the railroad. The last major attempt would be around the War of 1812 to break away and form their own country. And so the first of the really big land ordinances to come out to deal with something of this land, there are 2 huge ones, and they are still the law of the land today. The first one is the Land Ordinance of 1785. And so what it was is the federal government would send out surveyors to survey federal land, and they would divide the land into townships. Townships were 6 by 6 mile squares. So you see this map right here. They divide up the land, and if you look at land that's federal land, it's all a grid. It's all designed or based on the grid. In fact, this was the first area surveyed right here in Ohio. They divide east and west lines into a grid and make 6 by 6 mile squares, which could be divided up into 36 1 by 1 mile sections. And so you look at a land ownership map of Montana, especially the east where the mountains don't mess up the surveying, it is very much a square. See, just a checkerboard pattern. And if you go to a state that's really flat like Iowa, the whole state's a square. All the counties are done on these townships. Every road goes east or west, just about. And you really see the legacy of this. And then the sections can be divided up into half sections. Quarter sections were seen as like the ideal amount for a small farm at that time, 160 acres. But a 1 by 1 mile square is a huge hunk of land. And the revenue from one section of the sale, the revenue from one section must go to education. And this is the beginning of this concept of public education for everybody. The idea that the United States government will provide education. Now, it was unclear who would pay for the education, where this would go. Out of this would also come, by the 1860s, what's called land-grant colleges, aka Montana State University. And this would be funded by the sale of public land. And so this has a curious legacy, doesn't it? It does lead to the point that in the United States, we're going to value education, and you have an opportunity that is pretty amazing what is done for you right now. I mean, I am here at home teaching you. That's a pretty amazing thing. And the opportunities this give and what education actually means, that's a different argument. We'll come back to that. We're going to get to a guy named Horace Mann. But this sets up the idea of public education. What that means and what it will entail, that's going to come down the road. But it's the beginning of that legacy. An educated populace is necessary for a republic. That was what many of the founders believed. But there's another thing that comes out of this. This lasting legacy of public education and growth is going to come from land that was conquered and taken away from somebody who lived here. And the vast majority would die of disease or be slaughtered. And this is a very curious legacy. That remember the United States, we've mentioned this before with slavery and other issues. History is complex. There's no black and white. There's a lot of nuance. The Land Ordinance of 1785 is still the law. Still the law of the land. By the way, if you go to a place like Texas, they don't have this grid pattern. Texas was an independent country when it came into the Union in 1845. And therefore, they don't have this. Same with all the original 13 states and a few others because the land was already divided up. Kentucky's weird because of the squatters. Well, another ordinance is going to come out. Oh, so here is another picture of dividing up the land by townships, by squares. I don't know why I put another one up. I'm not going to talk about it anymore. Well, what kind of states then will come into this land? Well, one of the first laws would be proposed by Thomas Jefferson. Actually, his friends, he was in Paris. He was the U.S. ambassador to Paris. John Adams was in London. So a curious thing that's going to happen is two of the main authors, in fact, the main author of the Declaration of Independence, and these two authors are going to be overseas when the Constitution was written. They had virtually nothing to do, and it would turn out they had differing ideas about the Constitution. Jefferson was basically negative, Adams was basically positive at first. But Jefferson's idea was to divide these western lands, you see in green right here, into, originally he had 14 states. Soon there'll be 9. It's up in the air of how many states there would actually be. These are just generic lines put up there from Jefferson's notes. But Jefferson was looking at the future of the Republic and how would this place survive. And what he came to realize is something that is very much a truism, and the United States will find out. Slavery is incompatible with a republic, and therefore, no slave codes in any state west of the Appalachian Mountains. Remember slave codes. One of the short IDs I had you do was either on Bacon's Rebellion or racism. And you got points off if you did not mention slave codes for either one of those. I mentioned that those were the biggest things that came out of Bacon's Rebellion and the biggest single issue, the reason that racism as we know it exists. That was huge. Unbelievable. Most people got that. And so you got almost all the points. That was a biggie. That was worth 16 points. Actually 32 when I put it in the grade book. That was a big one then. I should add, I had people tell me that the Bacon's Rebellion was against British rule and led to the American Revolution, and it happened in Massachusetts. And therefore, you did not get the points. Some of you, that might be the one you got to redo it if you had any chance of getting any points. But no slave codes. So no slave codes mean no slavery. Now you'll see this as a shorthand that these will be these states will have no slavery, soon to be called free states. Don't think of free as you can. It's for free. It just meant that there were no slave codes. If there's no slave codes, you can't enforce slavery. Slavery will not function unless there's slave codes. You might have one or two individuals with a slave, but you can't have mass slavery. You need the militia, and you need all those laws to restrict slavery. Remember, the most important being the fornication laws. So when they say there's no slavery, and they say it's a free state, it means no slave codes. And that was his vote. But remember, how many votes did it require to pass the Articles of Confederation? Here's the amazing thing. It got 8 votes. 1 vote short. This is another one of those hinge moments. What if it passed? Now, it didn't mean that federal law could have changed these before it became a state, but they might have came in as states without slave codes and probably no slavery. So 8 votes. I should add, the federal government, because this is federal land, decides slave codes or no slave codes. Once they become a state, that's state law. Unless there was a change to the Constitution. 8 votes. And I think you can see what happened. If you look at all the states, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Maryland, a slave state, all these states voted against it because they had slavery. And we'll go into the complex reasons why. But what came out of this was a compromise. The Northwest Ordinance. The Northwest Ordinance of 1785. For some reason, I made that. I'm changing this because it's bugging me. Okay. Are we still broadcasting? Good. The Northwest Ordinance. And so what they said is these things. First off. Oh, you see these lines here? These are the names of Jefferson's idea for the states. And I love Michigania, Sylvania, Illinois, Polypotamia. Okay. But when a territory got 5,000 people, it would become a territory. It would still have federal laws, but the federal government would appoint a governor, and they would have a territorial legislature. So it would be a stepping stone to statehood. When it got 60,000, it could apply for statehood. And at the time, that seemed like a lot of people. But within 60 years or 80 years, this is going to be way too few. But clever politicians will take advantage of this. And even though 60,000 is tiny by 1889, let's say, the legislatures will still allow for a number of states, even with that few number of people in a territory. I'll give you an example. You're living in one. Montana was made a state in 1889 because Republicans who controlled the House and the Senate, just barely in 1888, put in a bunch of states when they're just barely over 60,000 because Republicans were worrying of a growing Democratic majority. That was in 1889. That's why Montana is a state. But then here's the other big thing. There'll be no slave codes in any of the 5 states created above the Ohio River. Now, we know the 5 states now, Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. But those states, they weren't decided yet. You just knew there were going to be 5 states. And no slave codes. No slave codes, no slavery. And so if you look at that on the surface, oops, wrong picture. Let me go back. But add this, and I should have put this in a slide, but I didn't, so deal with it. Once they have no slaves north of the Ohio River, that means, it's not the law, but by inference, it basically implies that states below the Ohio River will be slave. And so this is what you have to add. This will set up, and I'm going to type this in so I do not forget to do this. I should have done this. Remember I told you I had to make a bunch of these? I used to do on the board, but I couldn't do it because we're doing it online. This is one of the problems when you're thinking about things and not actually seeing it in front of you. Yeah. So, the sectional divide. Because the states below, which would turn out to be 4 states, by implication, they will be slave states. They will have slave codes. And if we look, so that means Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, and Mississippi with slavery. This will set up the sectional divide, slave versus free. It was already kind of happening because of the way the geography was, but now it is established by federal law. It does not mean that there can't be slaves in those areas. It just means there's no slave codes. And so it's very easy for a slave to, for example, run away. So these 2 laws, still the laws of the land. Still the laws. That's the biggest legacy of the Articles of Confederation that remains, except for something called the new Constitution. And so we have all these people beginning to pour into Ohio. I love this picture from this Conestoga wagon. This is early 1803, 1804, but for the Ohio River. I just thought that picture was kind of cool. And so with that, these are the 5 states that would appear. This is going to be known as the Old Northwest for years. The Old Northwest. And this would be the Southwest. It seems a little weird to our ears. Don't forget, a lot of squatters had come into Kentucky and then crossed over into Tennessee, and those are going to become states fairly soon. But this process will be there if the country's still around. Will the country still be around? Well, not with the economic depression. By the way, that is supposedly a fight between shoe dealers between the Connecticut and New York border. I just thought that picture was funny. But don't forget, it is essentially a market economy, but this is pre-capitalism. Capital, that's the technical definition. We'll talk a lot more about this. I've mentioned it before. It's the means of production, but that's the machines. They don't quite exist. So people are buying and selling goods in a market, but it's still hand or horsepower. They do everything. There's no national currency. So once again, there's no set way for people to know how much money will be worth and to try to get some idea of what the future will bring. States were all printing their own currency, and every state would have different rules on how much currency they would provide. And since it was unclear how the states would collect taxes, nobody's really sure if that currency was worth anything. And so what you have is this time where specie, which is gold coin, usually gold, sometimes silver coin, would be significantly more valuable than paper currency. So you have kind of a 2-tiered financial system, but that's not even enough. It's a multi-tiered because there are Spanish coin, British coin, some coin from states, some coin that just appeared. There's French franc still floating around, not pre-franc, but French money floating around. And there are no banks in the new United States. There are people who will loan money, kind of like loan sharks, but people who do loan money, merchants will loan. There is credit, or you can get a little bit of credit. For the most part, though, there's not a place where people can do the basic functions of a financial institution, which is store your wealth so it's safe and borrow money, which is now the number one thing that banks do now, is loan. There's no place for debtors to go. And so there's no real set rules for borrowing money. It's a financial mess. And so, like I said before, the future is a gray area. If you don't know if you can borrow money tomorrow, there's no way you can plan for the future. I can't emphasize that enough. I mean, right now, at this moment, think about right now, with coronavirus, what appears to be a growing economic depression. We're not sure though. Complete uncertainty. And has a month for the election. Who knows what's going to happen with the 2 or 3 weeks after the election. I mean, we're really in a gray area. I know. It's exciting. We're riding the wave. Would any of you be thinking, well, today's a good time to start a business. I'm going to borrow a bunch of money and start a restaurant. Really? Because you don't know what the future is. If you know that tomorrow will be good, or at least know when business will open up, will banks begin to open up, will people go out and start spending money? When you know that, then you invest. Right now, who's investing? That's part of the reason why I said we're on the could be an real big economic downturn, which we appear to be in, because you can't plan for the future. Imagine that being for a decade, all the time. That was the post-Revolutionary War U.S. So there's no investment. No investment. I said it, I forgot to click. So one thing on the PowerPoint, do I have the pointer so you can see it, the little red thing kind of zipping around the background? To click the mouse, it won't adjust the screen, so I got to hit my laptop. So I have 3 screens up. I should turn my phone on. So the money supply issue is one of the most important issues for the U.S. economy to this day. It's one of those things that most people don't understand, and I don't blame them, because you're getting into the weeds here. But to understand history, we have to know a little bit about it. And my goal here is to make you think about the value of money. No, you're not going to remember everything that happened in 1787. Why? I don't know. No, you're not going to remember that. But know that this has great effect on history. If you can't invest today, tomorrow could be worse. It's kind of scary. By the way, these are some of the currency from various states at this time. See New York, and this is from the colonies, United Colonies. So this is a continental. Look at all these. $50, $3, 10 shillings. They had all sorts of different denominations because there was no set. By the way, the term dollars comes from this silver mine in Bohemia, which is now Czechia, which is called taler. They mined so much silver from that and made coins. They call them dollars. There's a little bit of trivia the next time you need trivia. Okay, so inflation. Let's look at what inflation is. We've talked about this before because it's always important. But inflation, value of money drops, price goes up. We get that concept? Value drops, price goes up. So your money can't buy as much, but prices go up. If prices go up, profits go up. Profits go up, people might spend more. They might buy more. Demand might go up. Companies might need to hire more workers. Moderate inflation could be a really good thing. But if you have savings, let's say you have a bunch of money in the bank. Do you see a problem if the value drops? Your savings drops. Deflation. Value of money goes up. Price goes down. Get back to that guy with money in his bank. Hey, I don't have to do anything, and the value of my money goes up. But prices drop because your dollar buys more. And therefore, businesses don't make as much profit. Businesses might not invest as much because we're not making as much money. That means less money in the economy, so demand drops. Deflation has real consequences. But let's get to something that affects everybody. I can't emphasize enough that the value of money directly relates to debt. Everything comes back to debt. What about the debtors? Debtors are people who borrow money. Does inflation or deflation help them? What about the creditors? Those who loan money. Does this help or hurt them? Big question. Who benefits from inflation? Who benefits from deflation? And this is where we got to get down. Think about the debtor. If you borrow money today, that means tomorrow you got to pay that much money back, plus interest. You have to pay it back. Would inflation benefit you or deflation? I hope some of you are thinking inflation, because you'd be right. Inflation helps debtors because they pay back money of lesser value. So write that down, put an arrow, however you want to do it. Creditors, therefore, are benefited from deflation. They pay back money of greater value. So think about if you loan money. If there's moderate deflation, you're getting back not only money of greater value, but plus whatever interest you charge. By the way, you might see the big problem with inflation. If creditors are worried about inflation and they want to make money, they raise interest rates. The big problem with inflation is interest rates. Interest rates will go up because creditors have to make money. You should know that we have virtual deflation right now. Interest rates are basically zero. So we have this surreal moment that we have a tiny group of people who are investing madly in the stock market. The stock market went up pretty dramatically today, at least it has as of 40 minutes ago. And home construction is going up because interest rates are so low. At the same time, there's millions of people without money. We are in a weird world. But don't forget this. Creditors, they want deflation. Debtors, inflation. So that's where we get to governments. Because governments, they control the money supply. Or in the case of the Articles of Confederation, don't control it. And so if anybody out there says, I want a free market with no government interference, they have no idea what they're talking about. And I'm just being as blunt as I can be here. Because if there's no government interference, there's no money. There's no currency. There's chaos. There's what we have in much of the United States in 1786, or let's say Somalia. Governments decide the value of money and the money supply. They make the rules. This is not natural. Money does not grow on trees, literally. Well, and don't give me the paper thing. Shut up. So governments, they decide inflation or deflation. So they decide if they're going to help the creditors or the debtors. With no national government, that means individual states are doing this, and it's chaos. Because maybe it'll work in a state like, or a large state like Pennsylvania, but they're going to trade with New Jersey. Could that lead to war? Yes. And this is something you need to know. If the government is out there saying, we want inflation, we want moderate inflation, you know who runs the government. If we want deflation, you know who runs. Whomever controls the money supply runs the country. That is power. That's the real power. And by the way, no one ever talks about this. Those words I put down right here, that is the real power. When people elect government officials, it's money supply. It's the value of money and where the government will funnel money to. That's the power. So let's get back to this right up here. Debtors and creditors. I mean, we're talking about a truism in 1786, and it is arguably even more true in 2020. History doesn't repeat itself, but it echoes over and over and over. The same things that affected people then affect people now, because it tends to all deal with humans. Debtors and creditors. Why did I just put debtor? Now I see what was bugging me about that. Where's my mouse? Uh-oh. I'm going to add an S here. That was bugging me. I put down debtor, like one debtor, which is bad because which group is bigger? Are there more debtors or creditors? By definition, there are more, and circle this, creditors. Because to be a creditor, you need extra money. Money beyond survival. So money beyond food and shelter, you need extra money to loan. Debtors are coming to you hat in hand. Most people are debtors. Now, I should add, we live in a society today where the so-called richest people in the world owe a lot of money. in our president, he's going to owe about $450 million in the next 2 years. And so everybody's in debt. $450 million? Wow. I don't know where he's going to get it either. But there are more creditors. Therefore, a tiny group of people runs the country. By the way, what do we have now? Relative deflation. That's what the creditors want. Why do you think the big banks and those with money give so much money to politicians? Because they don't want inflation. They want deflation. Whomever controls the money supply runs the country. Period. They run the country. And that's why they give political donations. Not because they love democracy. No. They want policies that will funnel money from everybody else to them. Deflation funnels money from poor to wealthy. Just pours it in there. So you know who's running the states. So this gets to a big thing then. The debt issue. There's huge amount of debt. There's debt everywhere. And what to do about debt? Nobody is buying goods. Nobody has much money. There's actually very few goods to buy anyways. And since we're worried about tomorrow, even if you have money in, let's say, 1785, you're sitting there going, yeah, tomorrow might be worse. I better save what I got. I better save. So, if nobody is buying goods, and therefore it's really hard to make money, there's no way to pay back your loans. Farmers are just being crushed because farmers are really hit by this. Revolutionary War veterans were given almost nothing, but they were promised money. They got bonds. So they got bonds from the Continental Congress saying, okay, your service, you're loaning to us, and we'll pay you back when we pay back that bond in 20 years. Some of them got land, like in western Pennsylvania, but most got debt. So it's a piece of paper saying the government owes you money, the Continental Congress. Well, if you could not pay back your debt, and they were all in debt, they had debtor's court, and that's a debtor's court in the left-hand corner, and sometimes they would take your property and send you to jail. Now you might argue, wait a second. If they take your property and send you to jail, then you can't pay back your debt. Well, yeah, but then the creditor gets your property. And debtor's prison is hell on earth. It'll terrify debtors to do whatever they can to pay back their debt. By the way, look at this. Debtor's court. Who runs debtor's court? State governments. State governments? Oh, that means who runs government? The creditors, the very same people who are deciding the money supply. They rig the system to help them. They rig the system to make it almost impossible to pay back their debt, and then rig the system so they send the debtors to prison so they get their property. And we are still living a hodgepodge of rules by that. Anybody who rents knows what I'm talking about. And so with that, let's get to the money supply. There's going to be two states. On one side will be Massachusetts, and the other side is Rhode Island. And this would become important. My neighbor just walked by with his dog. By the way, you notice this? They wanted to make sure no one tried to use this for currency, so they punched a hole in it. I think that's great. And I wish we had $7 bills right now. Who's with me? $7 bills. Okay, so Massachusetts. Massachusetts looked at that, and what they did is they limited their currency. They said, we're going to print very little money. So they limited the amount of money in circulation. Now, this alone will not necessarily lead to inflation or deflation. But they limited the amount. And then said all taxes must be paid in specie. Well, virtually no one has specie except for the very wealthy. Taxes must be paid with it. There's already a bad economy. There's virtually no way for the farmers to make money. If they do make money, it's going to be in currency, which they can't afford to buy specie with. And so this is going to lead to horrific deflation. Horrific. Just hammering deflation. who runs Massachusetts. Next, Rhode Island. It went out of order. Rhode Island, they printed currency. In fact, significantly more currency. They got more currency out there. They want to make sure that people had money. They allowed you to pay land taxes in currency. So that once they allowed to have land taxes in currency, the value of the currency went up. And people expected and want currency. Now still, it's one of these weird things. There's more money in circulation, which could cause inflation. But at the same time, by demanding it for taxes, it can help with inflation. And then they wanted a wealth tax. They put a tax on large property owners. We have virtually no wealth tax. So the United States allows for the vast accumulation of wealth. We'll talk about that. This is still pre-capitalism. And so they had more inflation. So we have Rhode Island with inflation. Who runs Rhode Island? Massachusetts with deflation. Who runs deflation? Who runs deflation? Who runs Massachusetts? And so, which state, here's a question. Which state allowed more people to vote? There are two other terms for vote. Suffrage and the franchise. The franchise is a good name for the vote. The franchise is like, you might have heard of franchise for business where you're a part owner of a larger company. Well, as a voter, you're a part owner of the country. So which state allowed more people to vote? You weren't expecting that. You were expecting debtors or creditors. Which state allowed more people to vote? Which state allowed, the rule would have been less property? And which state allowed women to vote? Which state? Well, it should be quite obvious. There are significantly more creditors. And therefore, they would vote for this. Rhode Island allowed for greater suffrage. Regular people voted and they're debtors, and so they wanted inflation. And this should also lead you to a point. Those who want laws like this, to this day, they don't want people to vote. Those who want to help debtors, they want people to vote. You can see it today. One political party desperately wants more people to vote, and one political party is doing everything it can, including suing the state of Montana, to make it more difficult to vote. And just so you know, one state is a little bit more pro-debtor, just a tiny bit more, and therefore that's the Democrats. They want more people to vote. The Republicans, definitely more the party of the wealthy, and they are the ones suing the state of Montana to make it more difficult to vote right at this moment. And so it still exists to this day. And so, who is going to have greater suffrage? Oops, sorry about that. Why is it doing that? Why is it? Okay, everyone. Sorry about that. Ah. I don't know what I did. We'll try one more time. While you do that, why don't everyone... I gotta type something to somebody. I'm a little behind. Okay, this is where I messed up. So, who wants greater suffrage? And that is where you're going to get the conservative or liberal left-right divide. And I got a little bit left to finish here, but I have to go online. Give me a second. I have to tell my Western Civ class, I mean, it's just a few minutes late. I want to get to this one part and start Shays Rebellion. Okay, so let me just get through this and then I'm done. So, who wants greater suffrage? This is where we get when you hear the term right or left, or conservative or liberal. This comes to this day. Now, people misuse these terms all the time. It is much more complex than to say just simply are they conservative or liberal. I mean, it's than the voting or money supply. But it's basically this. Those who want greater suffrage, therefore, at this time, Rhode Island, that is left. That is liberal. Those who wanted less suffrage, that is right, and that is what they would call conservative. Conservative wants less suffrage. Keep things the same. Liberal, more people having economic rights. That is liberal. Now, let's be very clear. Both political parties are economically right now pretty conservative. And so it's it's much more complex of an issue than what my simple explanation here. But the legacy of liberals or the left wing is more people with a voice, more small d democracy, conservative anti-democracy. So the last thing I'm going to get to today, and then I'm going to go. So liberal wants greater suffrage. So Shays' rebellion. And Shays' rebellion's in Western Massachusetts. Western Massachusetts. These are veterans. Veterans of the Revolutionary War. And this is my favorite picture of Shay right here. I'm not even sure what he's supposed to be here. Yeah, I don't know what's going on, but that's supposed to be basically roughing up a tax collector. So, Western Massachusetts. And these are farmers, and farmers, as I mentioned before, are always in debt. They have very little money, very little wealth, and I lost my mouse. So, farmer debt. Farmers are always in debt. Don't forget, we talked about this before. Farmers basically get money once a year, and when it's done, they have to pay back. Everything from that money they get once a year. Daniel Shays was a veteran, an officer of the Revolutionary War. He had been given bonds and a little bit of land for his service as an officer, and he led a group of vigilantes. Now, don't think in terms of vigilantes here. Vigilantes here were basically pro-Confederacy thugs. Back then, there was no real law on the frontier, and these were people who were trying to protect the people, the small farmers of Massachusetts, from debtor's court. The government, the system was rigged. They were furious. In fact, write this down. Shay's big argument, he said, is these debtors' prison, this system of government is rigged against us. Most of us can't vote. He could vote, but most could not vote. This should remind you a little bit of Nathaniel Bacon, who was a landholder, who would end up with this huge group of the poor and indentured servants, slaves, etc. He was relatively wealthy for the area, but leading people who felt totally disenfranchised and out of the system. So, these regulators were looking at their friends, and some of them, who were losing their farms, losing everything in debtor's court, and even going to prison. And these are state courts. And so what they did is, and this is a picture not as good as I'd hoped, but a picture of them shutting down a debtor's court. They came in and slammed the doors and said, we're not going to follow your laws anymore. This is unfair and rigged against us. And so they shut it down. Now, they did what they always did. They sent the state militia out. They sent the state militia out from Springfield. Springfield, you can see where they went to Peterson and Sheffield. We're not going to worry, this map is pretty much worthless. But they sent the state militia out. Well, a lot of the militias they picked up along the way were the very same kind of people that made up the regulators. They were farmers who were losing their land. And they were furious, and much like Bacon's rebellion, they joined the rebellion. They said, you're right, the system is rigged. And they weren't looking at it like we want to get rid of Massachusetts or overthrow the government. What they were saying is, we want a fair government. We want a government that represents the people. And in fact, they saw this as very American. The social contract and the Declaration of Independence. Governments are there to provide or to protect people's rights. But if they infringe on their rights, like putting them to jail and rigging the system so they can't make a living, then people have the right to change it. They saw them as real patriots. As you can imagine, the wealthy merchants and the creditors in Boston and Springfield are like, oh my God, they're coming after us. And they're going to call them dangerous revolutionaries and terrorists. Fortunately for the militia, or for the state government, there was no real organization to Shays' Rebellion. This was an upsurge of anger, and yes, it shows on this map they marched to town, but for the most part, it was just simply a few people marching. They get a few farmers to join them. They might shut down a court, but move on. So the rebellion would eventually be put down. In fact, this great sign of last rebellion. And they show a militia here. From Boston, they were able to get cannon, hard to stand for cannon. Winter hit. And the richest people in the colonies, not just Massachusetts, they paid for a militia. They paid to shut down this rebellion. And so what they got were urban, the few city folk, poor in the city, they armed them to beat the rural folk, which is going to be a common practice. Put one group against the other. Does that sound like Bacon's rebellion? Shays would eventually be pardoned, and he would die in what is now Vermont. But they were relatively lenient. But this was a massive class rebellion. And it started in Massachusetts, but virtually every state appeared like they were on the edge of doing this. And the wealthy in the colonies were terrified. We spent good money to have this revolution and to set up the system, and now they're going to take it away from us by wanting rights. And so we're setting up this system. Oh, I should add one more thing. We're coming to a stronger government, because you might notice there was a rebellion, and who put it down? The wealthy. Why didn't the Confederation Congress? Because they don't have an army. And the richest people are starting to say, we need a strong central government. And on that happy note, I'm going to finish. So tomorrow I'll be in class. There will not be a quiz tomorrow for the B-Day students. I am thinking about a reading quiz for the first part of chapter 6. And if I do that, it'll be on teams. We'll see what kind of score we get on teams. Yay! But if there's no questions, all right, so I will make this due over the next 2 days. I'll put the assignment up. Please make a PDF. And on that happy note, with no questions, I will see you